Well, I haven't got any sort of formula to counterbalance all of the things that I'm supposed to have done, but here I am.
Jimmy Page helped build Led Zeppelin into one of the biggest bands in rock history. But behind the legendary riffs was a trail of songwriting disputes, strained relationships, addiction, and controversies that followed him for decades. From Dazed and Confused to the chaos of Zeppelin's final years, Page's story is far more complicated than the guitar god image fans remember. So how did one of rock's greatest musical masterminds become one of its most controversial figures? Let's get into it. One controversy started before Led Zeppelin even had its famous name.
To be able to not necessarily tell the tale, but to be able to go out there and pound the music.
In 1967, Page encountered the dark and haunting song Dazed and Confused, written and performed by American folk musician Jake Holmes. The track had an eerie atmosphere, a tense structure, and a sound that clearly made an impression. Not long afterward, the Yardbirds began performing their own version with major similarities in the song's core idea and mood. But there was one huge issue. Holmes wasn't credited. Then Led Zeppelin recorded Dazed and Confused, and Holmes's name still wasn't listed as the songwriter. The track became one of the band's signature early songs, while the debate over where it came from stayed mostly in the shadows. Page's version involved substantial musical changes and development, but Holmes maintained that the original composition was his. From Holmes' perspective, this wasn't simply another musician putting a fresh spin on an idea. It was his work being used without the recognition he believed he deserved. Years rolled by, Led Zeppelin became rock royalty, and Dazed and Confused grew into a classic. Eventually, Holmes challenged the situation and pursued legal action, alleging that his song had been used without proper authorization or compensation. The dispute was later settled, and subsequent releases changed the credit to acknowledge Holmes as the song's inspiration, while Page remained credited as the writer. But in rock circles, the controversy left a nasty question hanging in the air. Critics saw the episode as part of a larger debate surrounding Page and Led Zeppelin's borrowing from earlier musicians, while defenders pointed to the long tradition of artists transforming existing blues and folk material into something new. Either way, the Holmes dispute exposed a side of Page's legacy that was far more complicated than the untouchable guitar god image fans saw on stage. This wasn't just another music dispute. It became an early warning sign for critics watching Jimmy Page's rise. His final chapter with the Yardbirds was messy, and when the group fell apart, Page moved fast. With existing performance commitments still hanging over the band, he assembled a new lineup that eventually became Led Zeppelin. From a business angle, it was a smart move. But to some people around the collapsing Yardbirds, Page's ability to move forward so quickly could look cold and calculated. What had been a shared musical journey suddenly became the foundation for Page's next move. Old obligations were fulfilled with new musicians. The Yardbirds' identity eventually disappeared, and Page charged into something much bigger. Rather than framing this as proof that Page was predatory, the episode showed just how ruthless the rock business could be. Page had momentum, connections, and a clear vision, and he wasn't about to let the Yardbirds' collapse kill his next shot. Then Led Zeppelin became massive, and a much bigger controversy came knocking. As their catalog exploded around the world, questions emerged over the band's use of older blues material. Listeners and musicians noticed familiar lyrics, melodies, and musical ideas connected to earlier artists. Names including Willie Dixon and Howlin' Wolf became part of wider discussions about how Zeppelin borrowed from the blues tradition and where inspiration crossed into something more serious. That's where things got especially messy. Some songwriting disputes resulted in lawsuits, settlements, or later changes to credits. Willie Dixon, for example, pursued claims involving material associated with his earlier compositions. These weren't tiny songs sitting unnoticed in some dusty catalog. Led Zeppelin records were generating serious money, and becoming part of rock history. And Page wasn't known for publicly unpacking every accusation in detail. That reserved approach only added more mystery around the situation. Critics questioned whether Zeppelin had taken too much without giving enough recognition, while defenders argued that borrowing and reworking older material had long been common in blues and rock. But as the disputes piled up, one uncomfortable question became harder to ignore. Why did Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin keep ending up in these battles? Was it confidence, business calculation, or simply the anything-goes culture of rock at the time? Was it the belief that fame and power could make accountability disappear? Was Page so obsessed with the music around him that he felt free to absorb, reshape, and claim whatever inspired him? Or did Zeppelin's enormous success simply create a world where normal boundaries became dangerously blurry? Whatever the explanation, critics increasingly argued that Page wasn't merely honoring musical tradition, he was benefiting from it in ways that deserved serious scrutiny. But inside Led Zeppelin, the tension was different. It wasn't always screaming matches and dramatic exits. It could be quieter, colder, and harder to see. John Paul Jones was the band's understated backbone, bringing depth and sophistication that went far beyond heavy guitar riffs. His bass lines held the songs together, while his keyboards, arrangements, and musical versatility helped Zeppelin build a sound few other bands could touch. Yet Page remained the dominant force in the studio, particularly when it came to production and the band's overall sonic direction. Jones was famously reserved, and his lower public profile sometimes made his importance easier to overlook. Accounts of Zeppelin's internal dynamics suggest communication could be limited, especially as the pressures surrounding the band increased. Rather than claiming Jones was deliberately shut out at every turn, the bigger picture was more complicated. Page commanded enormous creative influence, while Jones often operated quietly, doing crucial work without chasing the spotlight. That contrast became impossible to miss. Page increasingly represented the mastermind behind Zeppelin's sound, while Jones was the low-key musical weapon helping everything function. Any frustration between them wasn't usually played out as some explosive public feud. It lived beneath the surface, inside a band where four huge personalities didn't always communicate openly. Then there was Robert Plant, the voice, face, and emotional fire of Led Zeppelin. As Page's reported drug problems became more serious during Zeppelin's later years, the balance inside the band grew increasingly difficult. Plant was dealing with his own devastating personal struggles while still carrying the expectations that came with fronting one of the biggest bands on Earth. The distance between Plant and Page wasn't simply about who controlled the music. Their lives were changing, tragedy was hitting the band, and Page's increasingly troubled condition complicated an already intense partnership. On stage, they could still look unstoppable, but behind that image, cracks were getting harder to hide, and Plant was beginning to experience Led Zeppelin very differently from the man standing beside him. The distance became emotional too. Communication reportedly grew thinner, and a partnership that had once seemed almost instinctive became harder to maintain. Then tragedy shattered Robert Plant's world. After the death of his young son Karak in 1977, Plant's priorities understandably changed, and questions about Led Zeppelin's future became far more serious. At a moment of unimaginable grief, the machinery surrounding one of rock's biggest bands suddenly didn't matter the way it once had. What had looked like brotherhood was now under brutal pressure. Plant and Page still shared an enormous musical history, but tragedy, exhaustion, and increasingly different circumstances complicated that bond. Rather than reducing their relationship to simple resentment, it became something heavier, a partnership carrying grief, fame, expectations, and problems that couldn't simply be fixed by walking back into a studio. And Zeppelin's life on the road had already developed an infamous reputation. Stories involving trashed hotel rooms, wild excess, confrontations, and disturbing backstage behavior became part of the band's mythology. Some accounts have been exaggerated or disputed over the decades, but there's little question that Zeppelin toured inside a rock culture where extreme behavior could be normalized. Promoters, hotel workers, crews, and fellow musicians sometimes had to deal with the fallout. For critics, Page's role raised another uncomfortable issue. He wasn't necessarily responsible for every incident involving the band or its entourage, and it would be unfair to claim he personally approved everything that happened. But as Zeppelin's leader and producer, his apparent failure to publicly challenge that culture became part of the criticism surrounding him. When nobody seemed willing to slam the brakes, the chaos could keep rolling. Then Page's own condition became impossible to ignore. By the later 1970s, his heroin use was seriously affecting his health and reliability. His appearance changed dramatically, and accounts from this period describe a musician increasingly consumed by addiction. That instability inevitably hit the band. Some performances became uneven, recording could become difficult, and the unstoppable machine Led Zeppelin once appeared to be was suddenly running on shaky ground. Page had built a reputation as the focused architect behind the band's massive sound, but addiction was now threatening that control. People around Zeppelin were watching one of rock's most powerful figures become increasingly withdrawn and physically diminished, and the consequences were spreading far beyond Page himself. To people watching Led Zeppelin in its final years, the change was impossible to miss. Jimmy Page, once the focused mastermind pushing the band forward, was struggling with addiction and the enormous pressure surrounding Zeppelin. The machine was still moving, but behind the legendary image, the cracks were getting wider. Then, in 1980, John Bonham died, and Led Zeppelin stopped. Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones ultimately decided they could not continue as Led Zeppelin without him. There was no replacement drummer brought in to keep the empire rolling. Bonham wasn't simply another member of the lineup. His playing was fundamental to the chemistry that made Zeppelin sound like Zeppelin. His death also came after years of extreme touring, personal tragedy, substance abuse, and growing strain around the band. It would be unfair to say Zeppelin had already completely collapsed before Bonham died, but the group had clearly endured a brutal stretch. Plant had suffered devastating loss. Page was battling serious drug problems, and the carefree energy of Zeppelin's early rise had been replaced by something much heavier. For Page, the aftermath was especially difficult. The band that had dominated his life was suddenly gone. His career continued, and he would eventually work with other musicians and reunite with his former bandmates on selected occasions. But Led Zeppelin as a full-time force was finished. The guitarist who had spent years carefully shaping the band's sound now had to figure out who he was without it. And that's what makes Jimmy Page's legacy so complicated. His riffs influenced generations. His production changed hard rock, and his guitar work remains instantly recognizable. At the same time, controversies involving songwriting credits, Zeppelin's culture of excess, fractured relationships, and Page's struggles with addiction remain part of the historical conversation. Some musicians and fans see a visionary who helped completely change rock music. Others focus on the controversies and choices surrounding the man behind that music. Both sides help explain why Page remains such a fascinating and divisive figure decades later. So what do you think? Does Jimmy Page's musical genius outweigh the controversies surrounding his legacy, or do those controversies permanently change how you see him? Drop your opinion in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.